Have you ever witnessed a moment so raw and authentic that it changed how you view celebrity interviews forever? Share your thoughts in the comments on what makes vulnerability in public figures so powerful. Margaret Qualley walked onto Conan's stage with that effortless grace that has become her trademark, a casual wave to the audience, a warm smile that gave no hint of the moment about to unfold. No one in the studio that night could have predicted how a routine late-night interview would transform into something so unexpected, so genuinely moving, that it would leave Conan O'Brien completely frozen in his chair and an audience collectively holding their breath. The Warner Brothers studio in Burbank buzzed with energy. Production assistants rushed through final checks. Audience members settled into their seats, phones dutifully tucked away as instructed. Excited whispers about the young actress who'd recently earned critical acclaim for her performance in the indie darling everyone was talking about. It was supposed to be a standard promotional stop, another night of light-hearted banter and amusing anecdotes, the formula that had defined late-night television for decades. Backstage, Conan O'Brien reviewed his note cards. His team had prepared the usual mix of film clips, quirky questions, and potential segues into one of his signature comedic bits. Conan, a veteran of the late-night landscape, knew exactly how to navigate these celebrity interviews, when to push for a laugh, when to pull back, how to make guests feel comfortable enough to share the rehearsed stories that seemed spontaneous but rarely were. In the green room, Margaret Qualley sat quietly, dressed in a simple black jumpsuit, hair pulled back. At 27, she carried herself with a poise that belied her years. The daughter of actress Andie MacDowell, she'd grown up adjacent to Hollywood's machinery, understood its rhythms and expectations, but there was something different about her tonight, a thoughtfulness in her expression that the makeup artist noticed but didn't mention. 5 minutes, Ms. Qualley, called a production assistant. She nodded, set down her phone, and took a deep breath, not from nervousness about the appearance, but from the weight of the decision she'd made just hours before arriving at the studio. The show began with Conan's monologue, sharp, self-deprecating jokes landing perfectly, audience laughter filling the room on cue. Then came the moment. My first guest tonight is a brilliant young actress. You know her from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and her Emmy-nominated role in Maid. Please welcome the incredibly talented Margaret Qualley. The audience applauded enthusiastically as Margaret walked out, smiling, embracing Conan with genuine warmth before settling into the guest chair, crossing her legs casually, appearing perfectly at ease, the picture of Hollywood composure. "Margaret, it's so great to have you here," Conan began with his characteristic enthusiasm. "I'm a huge fan of your work, especially Maid, which just wrecked me emotionally, by the way." "Thank you," she smiled. "That means a lot. It was a project very close to my heart. You played a young single mother escaping an abusive relationship, fighting through poverty and a broken system. It was incredibly powerful," Conan continued. "What drew you to that role?" Margaret nodded, considering the question. "I was moved by the story, by this woman's resilience, by how she fought for her daughter, for herself, against nearly impossible odds." She shifted slightly in her chair, a subtle change that only the most observant might have noticed. "But what really connected me to the role was understanding how many women are actually living that reality right now." Something in her tone made Conan lean forward slightly, sensing there might be more to this answer than the usual promotional talking points. "The statistics are staggering," she continued. "Domestic violence, economic insecurity, the impossible choices people have to make just to keep their children safe, to survive." Conan nodded. The show definitely opened a lot of eyes to realities many viewers might not encounter directly. "That's what I hoped it would do," Margaret agreed, then paused, seeming to make a decision. "And actually, that's why I wanted to come here tonight, not just to talk about my next project, but to share something I've never talked about publicly before." The studio grew noticeably quieter, the collective sense that something unscripted was about to unfold. Conan, always skilled at reading the room, set aside his prepared questions. "I'm listening," he said simply. Margaret took a breath, the kind that precedes something true, something difficult. "When I was preparing for the role in Maid, I spent time with women in shelters, women who had escaped violent homes with nothing but their children and the clothes they wore." She maintained perfect composure, but her eyes revealed the emotional weight of what she was sharing. "Their stories changed me profoundly. Not just as an actress, but as a human being, and they also unlocked something in me, a memory I had buried for a very long time. The audience was completely still now, all phones forgotten, all attention fixed on this unexpected turn in the conversation. When I was 9 years old, Margaret continued, her voice steady but vulnerable, my mother and I spent 3 months in a shelter after leaving a volatile situation at home. Conan's expression shifted from interest to genuine surprise. Clearly, this was not in the pre-interview notes, not something his team had prepared him for. No one in the industry knows this. It's not in my biography, not in any interview. It's something my family protected me from having to discuss until I was ready, until it felt right. She glanced briefly at the audience, not performing for them anymore, but including them in a moment of shared truth. But working on Made, embodying that story, living in Alex's skin day after day during filming, I realized that keeping this experience hidden was inadvertently contributing to the shame that surrounds domestic violence, the silence that protects abusers and isolates survivors. A camera caught a woman in the audience nodding emphatically, eyes glistening with tears, her reaction mirroring what many were feeling. The most powerful thing about Made as a story is that it shows the complexity of these situations, how someone can be trapped not just by fear, but by economics, by systems, by isolation, by love that's become dangerously distorted. Conan, visibly moved by Margaret's unexpected candor, asked quietly, "What gave you the courage to share this tonight?" Margaret's eyes softened, looking somewhere beyond the studio. "Yesterday, I received a letter from a young woman who watched Made with her mother, a mother who had left an abusive home years ago, carrying this young woman as a baby." She paused, the weight of this connection hanging in the air between her and Conan. She wrote that watching the show together allowed them to talk about that experience for the first time, to process what they'd been through, to name it, to begin healing from it. The studio was so quiet now that the sound technicians checked their equipment to make sure everything was still functioning. And I realized that our stories have power, not just the ones we tell on screen, but the ones we live, the ones we share, especially when they might help someone else feel less alone in their struggle. Conan, genuinely engaged now beyond any hosting duties, leaned forward. "That's incredibly brave, Margaret, to use your platform this way." She shook her head slightly. "It doesn't feel brave. It just feels necessary. There are millions of women and children experiencing domestic violence right now, living in fear, in isolation, in shame, thinking they're alone, thinking they're somehow at fault." Her voice remained steady, but her eyes conveyed the deep emotional current beneath her words. "If sharing my experience helps even one person recognize their situation, seek support, or simply feel less alone in what they're going through, then any discomfort I might feel becomes insignificant." The audience began to applaud spontaneously, not prompted by any applause sign or studio cue, but moved by the genuine courage unfolding before them. When the applause subsided, Conan asked, "How did that experience shape you as a person, as an artist?" Margaret considered this thoughtfully. "It made me understand, from a very young age, the gap between perception and reality, between the face people show the world and what might be happening behind closed doors." She gestured slightly with her hands. "That's probably why I became an actress. This fascination with the stories we tell versus the stories we live, the masks we wear, the truths we hide." Conan nodded, completely present in a way that transcended his usual hosting persona. "But more importantly," Margaret continued, "it gave me profound empathy for people navigating impossible situations, making impossible choices with courage that never makes headlines, never wins awards, never gets recognized." She looked directly at the camera now, not with calculation, but with intention, knowing her words might reach someone who needed them. There's a moment in Made when Alex realizes that leaving doesn't happen just once. It's a decision you have to make over and over, facing doubt, facing judgment, facing your own heart. And that was true to my experience, watching my mother's strength, her determination to build a safe life for us, no matter what it took. A man in the audience wiped his eyes quickly. Others nodded in solemn recognition, the collective witness to something authentically powerful. "Your mother is Andie MacDowell, who played your character's mother in Made," Conan observed. "That must have added another layer to the experience." Margaret smiled, a genuine expression of love. Working with my mom on this particular project was one of the most healing experiences of my life. A full-circle moment that I never could have anticipated when I was that 9-year-old girl in a shelter, wondering what would happen next. The emotional resonance of this revelation rippled through the studio, and many in the audience visibly moved. We never talked about it explicitly during filming, but there was this unspoken understanding between us, this shared knowledge that made certain scenes almost unbearably real. She brushed a strand of hair from her face, a simple, human gesture that seemed to emphasize the authenticity of the moment. There's a scene where my character finally stands up to her mother's boyfriend and protects her mother, and in rehearsal I just broke down completely, unexpected, completely unplanned, because suddenly I was that little girl again, wishing I could have protected my mom, wishing I could have been stronger, braver. Conan, deeply engaged in this unexpected conversation, nodded gently. Children often feel that responsibility, even though it was never theirs to carry. Exactly, Margaret agreed. And that's one of the cruelest parts of domestic violence, how it distorts everything, even a child's understanding of their place in the world. She took another breath, centering herself. But that's also why representation matters so much, why telling these stories authentically is crucial, because somewhere right now, a child is living in that distorted reality, thinking it's normal, thinking it's what they deserve, or worse, thinking there's no way out. The audience seemed to collectively exhale, some nodding in recognition of this universal truth. And women are watching who need to know that leaving is possible, that healing is possible, that there is support, that there is hope, even when it seems impossible to imagine. Conan, now fully invested in this profound exchange, asked, "What would you say to someone who might be watching right now, who's living in a situation like you described?" Margaret looked directly into the camera again, her expression both gentle and resolute. "I would say, you are not alone. You are not to blame, and your instinct that something is wrong is valid and worth listening to." Her voice carried a quiet strength that seemed to reach beyond the studio walls. "I would say that leaving is the hardest thing you might ever do, but not leaving might cost you everything, including yourself." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I would say there are people who will help you, resources that exist specifically for this situation, and though the journey won't be easy, on the other side is a life where you can breathe again, where you can find yourself again, where safety isn't something you have to earn, but something you deserve simply by existing." The studio was completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath as Margaret continued. "And I would say to anyone who has already left, who's struggling with doubt, with guilt, with fear, that you have done the bravest thing possible, and every day you wake up and choose yourself, choose safety, choose healing. You are rewriting your story. You are breaking cycles that might have continued for generations, and that is a victory worth celebrating, even on the hardest days." As she finished speaking, the audience rose to their feet spontaneously, a standing ovation not for her performance on screen but for her courage in that moment, for the truth she had offered so generously. Conan stood too, visibly moved, waiting for the applause to subside before saying, "I've been doing this job for decades, and I don't think I've ever been part of a more important conversation than this one. Thank you for trusting us with your story." Margaret nodded, the emotion finally showing in the slight tremor of her smile. "Thank you for giving me the space to share it." "We need to take a break," Conan said when the audience finally quieted. "But when we come back, more with Margaret Qualley, though I'm not sure how we follow that." As the cameras cut away for commercial, the energy in the studio remained charged with meaning. Audience members turned to each other, some sharing their own stories in hushed tones, others simply sitting in thoughtful silence, processing what they had witnessed. In the control room, producers watched in awe, knowing they had just been part of something extraordinary. Not a viral moment manufactured for views, but a genuine human connection that would resonate far beyond the usual metrics of success. The show's social media manager sat stunned, typing notes with shaking hands, knowing this segment would need special handling, knowing it had transcended the typical celebrity promotion to become something people would still be discussing long after the usual pop culture moments had faded. When they returned from commercial, Conan acknowledged the uncommon nature of what had just transpired. "I want to thank you again, Margaret, for that conversation. I think everyone here knows they just witnessed something truly significant." Margaret nodded, composure regained but a new openness visible in her expression. "It feels like a weight has been lifted, honestly. Carrying secrets takes so much energy. Energy better spent on healing, on growth, on helping others find their way through. I imagine many people will reach out to you after this," Conan observed. "How do you feel about becoming a voice for this issue when you came to Hollywood to be an actress, not an advocate?" Margaret considered this thoughtfully. "I think they're not as separate as they might seem. Great acting is about truth, about humanity, about connecting people to experiences they might never have directly but can understand through story." She smiled softly. "And advocacy is just another form of storytelling, shining light on truths that need to be seen, creating space for voices that have been silenced, building bridges between experiences." Conan nodded. "That's a profound way to look at it. Besides," Margaret added, "I didn't plan this. I didn't come here tonight with an agenda. I just knew it was time to speak my truth and trust that it might reach whoever needs to hear it." The remainder of the interview shifted to lighter topics: her upcoming projects, her love of dance, her famous friendship with Channing Tatum. But something had fundamentally changed. The usual promotional veneer had been pierced, replaced by something more authentic, more human, that colored even these lighter exchanges. By the time the segment ended with Margaret good-naturedly teaching Conan a dance move from her years as a ballet student, the audience had experienced something rare in the landscape of late-night television: genuine human connection that transcended the usual expectations of celebrity appearances. As Margaret waved goodbye to the appreciative crowd, as the house band played her off stage, as Conan thanked her one final time, everyone present knew they had witnessed something they would remember long after they'd forgotten most talk show moments. By morning, clips of the interview were everywhere, not selected for humor or entertainment value, but shared for their courage, their authenticity, and their potential to help others in similar situations. Margaret Qualley just changed how celebrities use their platform, trended across social media, comment sections filled with personal reflections, viewers sharing their own stories of survival, of leaving, of healing, of finding hope. Domestic violence hotlines reported a surge in calls, shelter websites saw increased traffic, and awareness organizations received unexpected donations, all citing the interview as their motivation. A social work professor at UCLA showed the clip to her class. "This is how you break silence around trauma, with dignity, with purpose, with hope." A support group in Philadelphia used the segment as a starting point for discussion about healing and visibility. A high school counselor in Detroit shared it with colleagues as a resource for identifying students at risk. What made the interview resonate wasn't celebrity, but authenticity. The courage to speak difficult truths with such thoughtfulness and compassion by someone people were used to seeing only through the lens of characters and red carpets. 3 days later, at a women's shelter in Los Angeles, Margaret arrived without cameras, without publicists, simply to talk with residents, to listen to their stories, to connect resources with needs and presence with purpose. One woman approached her with tears in her eyes. "I watched you on Conan with my teenage daughter. It was the first time we've ever really talked about what we went through together. Thank you for making that possible." Margaret embraced her, two survivors recognizing each other, no hierarchy of fame, just shared humanity, the kind of connection that transcends all boundaries. In New York, at a media panel discussion, Conan was asked about the now famous segment. "In 30 years of doing this, that might be the most meaningful exchange I've ever been privileged to be part of, not because it was dramatic or sensational, but because it was real, it was necessary, and it might help people." He paused, considering his words. "We talk a lot about platform and reach in this business, but rarely about responsibility and purpose." Margaret reminded all of us that fame is only valuable when it serves something larger than itself. A week later, Margaret's mother, Andie MacDowell, appeared on a morning show. When asked about her daughter's revelation, her eyes filled with tears of pride. "What you saw was a young woman choosing to transform her pain into purpose, to use her voice for those who haven't found theirs yet. As her mother, I couldn't be more proud or more hopeful about the conversations this will start." In living rooms across America, Viewers who had tuned in expecting celebrity anecdotes found themselves instead in deep reflection about silence and shame, courage and healing, about the power of truth to create change. A mother in Seattle finally told her adult children about the abuse she'd escaped before they were born. A college student in Chicago called the campus counseling center to talk about childhood experiences she'd never shared. A couple in Tennessee had their first honest conversation about the dynamics in their relationship, finding words for concerns that had felt unspeakable. The ripples continued outward, not in the dramatic, quantifiable ways that media outlets typically measure, but in the quiet, profound shifts that happen when the truth is spoken, when shame is replaced with understanding, and when isolation gives way to connection. 6 months later, Margaret included a resource guide with every press interview for her new film, a simple list of hotlines, websites, and organizations available to anyone experiencing domestic violence. When asked about this unusual addition to press materials, she explained simply, "Entertainment matters, art matters, film matters, but some things matter more, and if my platform can connect even one person with the help they need at a crucial moment, then it's being used exactly as it should be." What had begun as a standard late-night appearance had evolved into something far more meaningful, a cultural touchstone, a reference point for conversations about trauma and healing, about the responsibility of visibility, about the courage to speak truth even in settings designed for lighter fare. Margaret returned to her work, Conan to his show, the audience to their lives, but something had shifted, however slightly, a reminder that beneath our roles and responsibilities, our public personas, our curated images, we share this fundamental human capacity for courage, for compassion, for transforming pain into purpose. That night on Conan hadn't been about promotion. It had been about the possibility, about the potential of truth to create change, about the power of vulnerability to forge a connection in a world that often rewards silence and separation. And in a media landscape increasingly defined by controversy and division, by manufactured moments and strategic sharing, that kind of authentic human exchange wasn't just refreshing, it was revolutionary. In an industry built on image and illusion, Margaret had chosen substance and truth, not for acclaim or attention, but because she understood that stories have the power to heal, to inspire, to change, not just on screen, but in life. If this story moved you, if you recognized yourself in any part of it, if you've ever witnessed a moment of genuine authenticity that changed your perspective, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters in this conversation. Don't forget to like this video if you found value in it, and subscribe to join our community where we explore the power of genuine human connection in an increasingly curated world. Together, we can celebrate the courage it takes to transform personal pain into purpose that serves others.